Hey everyone, and welcome to this mobility video. I did a mobility survey and I got tons of information that I want to share to help you. One of the main concerns for most of the people or interest was around the hip and back, and we're going to have specific videos for hips and backs coming up. First of all, I want to talk about what mobility is to start with. Many of us, we think about mobility as like range of motion, of course, and that's also maybe how I would see it, but it's also function in that range of motion. Most people like to think about their range of motion or mobility as something genetic. I'm born this way. I have no other option. I was always this stiff, or my mom was this stiff, or my doctor was this stiff. It's always somebody else was the stiff, or you were the stiff, or your dad was the stiff. So are there any genetics tucking into this? The short answer is yes. Mostly has to do with something called epigenetics, meaning things you do in everyday life will have an impact on your DNA that will also cause some of these adaptations. Common things that we look at when it comes to mobility, and if we will tie this to genetics, if we divide the mobility into 4 different categories, which I like to do, is neurological, tissue, strength, and skeletal. So the most obvious one is that skeletal will probably be genetic thing, meaning your genes are going to determine how your skeleton, how your bones are built. Kind of, because think about this. Whatever you ate as a kid, whatever you fed yourself or your parents fed you, will actually have an impact on your skeletal build. So that's how epigenetics work. You eat something and you have good nutrition and stuff like that, you will have a different kind of build. If you have poor nutrition, you will have a different kind of build. And this will have an impact on your mobility. Look at strength. Then are you built with a certain strength? Maybe not. I would say not. It really has to do 100% with your environment. Are you moving at all or not? Again, how this ties up with your genetics is that the more you do as a kid, the more strength you're probably going to have the older you get too. So what you feed into the system early into your life will have an impact. Tissue stiffness. How about this? Is this genetic? You kind of have these kind of stiffness in your joints because the tissues are stiff. Is this genetic? Yeah, it could be genetic. Again, depending on what you've been feeding your system from early age will have an impact on how your joints and how your tendons will function. And this comes down to, if you look in populations, you will have, different kind of nutrients and foods that will have an impact on this. But the general one is hydration overall, and that it's not only water, like how it doesn't just help to drink water, but you have to get that water inside the body. So the question is do you have all the electrolytes that will bring the water into the body? And also, do you have enough blood flow coming through those joints so the joints are actually being flexible and moving? Neurological. If you're born with a certain handicap, obviously that can be, or parts of the brain are dead, that can have a big impact on your mobility. But let's say most people don't have that. What can happen is more, again, early in your adaptation as a person in this beautiful world, you have not been exposed to a lot of different angles, movements, and stuff like that. So your brain has not developed those neurological pathways to be able to function in certain positions. Now, the great thing is if you look at kids, mostly kids are by themselves trying to play as much. And you see this with puppies, you see this with, any kind of animal. They usually tend to play when they're small. Mammals, for sure, play. And this is how you express a lot of the mobility that you're actually born with. And the more you play, the more you explore, the more adaptations you have, and those neurological pathways will be created in the brain. Now, what can we do? We can look into these different areas and assess ourselves a bit, like how does it look like? What is my typical stiffness? So if we look at the hips, for example, or back, is it neurological? Is it tissue stiffness? Is it strength? Is it skeletal? If we look at most people, it usually has something to do with a lack of strength and tissue stiffness, but maybe not in those, particularly in the back. If we take the back, the tissue stiffness might be in the ankle, knee, or hips, or in the upper part of the shoulders, creating a lot of pressure on the lower back, and then resulting in a cascade of things, and then you might get a skeletal problem after having a lot of pain and inflammation over time. Priority. We want to prioritize neurological control to certain parts, depending on what we're working on, but see that we have a control from our mind to the body part that we want to move, or just the movement that we want to do. Many people like to think about mobility as like just a joint movement or something like that, but I like to see it in a movement pattern. So can you demonstrate this in a functional movement, for example? So what we do in the gym, can we express a squat? Can we express a press overhead? That's more important than to think about only what the joint is doing. So this is the neurological aspect. We prioritize that. Then we will go into more of the tissue stiffness and strength. This might be combined. And at the end, skeletal, mostly we cannot do that much, like without having surgery. So this one is usually untouched, and we try to work in these three different areas. I already talked about a lot about the causes from getting mobility issues and restrictions, and the neurological cause of somebody not being able to move as they want, or to press overhead or so on, is usually, again, not using that joint or not expressing that movement. And basically the brain will cut down or forget about stuff it's been doing before, and it gets rusty. So you need to kind of start working on that. That's kind of the solution of it. We have tissue stiffness. Why? Well, I talked about this. Maybe we're not getting enough body fluid to those places. Again, maybe we're not even using those joints as we should be, meaning on a regular basis, I'm not squatting below parallel, I'm not pressing overhead, and so on. The body works with a very simple rule, which is called use it or lose it. That's usually where tissue stiffness comes from. And like I alluded to already, is that how do we restore it? Well, usually it's by introducing movements again in a safe way. So you don't want to go from 0 to 100 in your first day. But let's say you have a movement restriction, have some fun drawings on the board. But let's say we want to have full 360 degrees range of motion, which I don't recommend, but let's say, just for the sake of it. And today we have only range of motion until 180 degrees. Our goal is obviously, I cannot press myself to 360 degrees up here, but my first goal is obviously to get 185 and then progress that way. Next one, we have strength, a very common issue that, again, we haven't used a certain movement pattern. So basically those muscles get turned off. And when those muscles get turned off, they start to weaken. Now we start to see all kind of crazy adaptational things happening. So instead of using our hamstrings, for example, when we're bending over, we start to use our back instead, because the body is simply scared of you falling over. So it has much more control over the spine. Cause for lack of strength is because we're simply not using it, and then we have this cascade of problems and adaptations happening to just mitigate that strength issue. How do we solve that? Well, we start introducing and gaining strength again. How does it work? Well, we know this from strength training. We don't go from 20 kilo back squat to 200 kilo back squat in the first day, but you go from 20 kilo back squat And first goal is to get to 22, and then to 24, 30, and so on. Same thing when it comes to mobility. You don't go from 0 to 100. You go step by step. Last one, skeletal. It might be genetic. It might be coming from very early stages of malnutrition or so. What is the solution? It might just be surgery, unfortunately, or we have to find an adaptation that allows you to function